So our professor, Alex Hunt, is the Vincent Haley Professor of Western American Studies at West Texas A&M University. So some of you might have guessed he's not joining us physically in person here in Ketchikan, where it is very overcast, which I'm sure is the opposite of Texas. In addition to being a professor of English, he is a director of the Center of the Study of the American West. He's been published widely on Western and Southwestern literature and history and culture. Hunt was born in Fairbanks, where his father, William R. Hunt, was a professor of history, and he's seeking to reconnect to his Alaska roots. So we're delighted when we here at the museum become aware of connections like Leslie Marmon Silko's to Ketchikan. So to give you an idea, the collections team here fielded something like 280, well over 280 research requests last year. Sometimes those requests are made by other institutes, other museums, people like that. Sometimes they're used for scholarly journals or academic books, for news articles, photo requests from the public, near and far. So there's a variety of different things like that. And we have lots of individual researchers who come and access the collection. And really, our collection and the community's archive have gained so much when those people who do the research add to our knowledge of what we hold and what we know about ourselves and our community here. It's value added all the way around. So we learn a lot through that process, which is why we are so grateful this afternoon to welcome Professor Hunt to be with us and to share some of that research into today's Museum Midday. The Ketchikan connection between Leslie Marmon Silko's Storyteller and climate change. So we'll hand it off to Professor Hunt, and we'll have some questions later, but if you want to drop those in the chat if you're joining us online, we'll do that too.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I'm really, truly excited to talk to you because I really do want to make some connections here. And I've never been to Ketchikan, so I'd be happy to get there someday. So this talk, as Erica mentioned, let's see if it's going to advance. There we go. This talk sort of came out of the fact that my father died about a year ago, or a little more than a year ago. And he's the reason that I was born in Alaska, because he came up from Seattle to become a history professor at University of Alaska Fairbanks, where he was for 12 years. And he wrote a great deal of Alaska history. So I didn't live my whole childhood in Alaska, but I was born in Fairbanks. I graduated from high school in Anchorage, and I spent time in the state between various times. I hadn't been back for a very long time, and so this project sort of gave me an excuse to reconnect with Alaska a little bit following my father's death. So I'm just really tickled to be here with you today. And I tried to cut this paper down a little bit so that I don't talk too terribly long, and because I really do want to hear from you. I hope that this paper already benefited from the museum there in Ketchikan and local knowledge in Ketchikan, and I want more of that. So I would really love to hear from folks. So anyway, getting started a little bit. So Leslie Marmon Silko is a Laguna Pueblo writer of northern New Mexico, very strongly associated with Southwest and literary regionalism, as well as the rise of Native American literature. In an exception to her Southwestern settings, in 1975, she wrote a short story called Storyteller, which is set in Bethel, Alaska. The well-known and often taught story has little-known Alaskan origin as well, because, as you may know, it was written in Ketchikan, where she lived for 2 years. In Storyteller, the unnamed protagonist is a young Yupik woman who gets revenge against white oil drillers in her act of murder on an icy river. But her larger act of resistance, as the story suggests, is storytelling itself. And so this talk centers upon that short story, as well as Silko's novel Ceremony, which we'll get to in a minute. But before I get to Silko, I want to tell you a little bit about what I do, because it's sort of helps explain how I'm coming at this. I'm a professor of English, and as Erica mentioned, I also direct the Center for the Study of the American West here at West Texas A&M, which has been a great experience for me. And here at the center, it's called Seesaw. We sort of do a kind of critical regionalism, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that term means. But we do a number of projects. For example, we're working on uncovering the Mexican-American history of the Southern Plains region, which has been sort of obscured and erased and forgotten in various ways. We are also seeking to build connections with Comanche and Kiowa and other native peoples who were removed from this area in the late 19th century. And we're also trying to draw attention to our regional environment and environmental concerns. We have done our part, I think, to address drawdown in the Ogallala Aquifer, which is a major problem that we're facing here. We are host to the petroleum industry in a big way in this region. And so we also, I think, need to talk about climate change and what's happening as a result of that history of petroleum exploration, which of course is another Alaska connection. So that's the sort of projects, the sort of work that the Center for the Study of the American West is engaged with. We've brought some pretty significant speakers to talk about climate change issues, including Catherine Hayhoe, which is a fun name to say, but she's kind of a big deal in climate change discourse. And also Daniel Cohen from the University of Houston, or from Rice University, an engineer who's talking about climate change. So we've had some fairly major speaking events and public events centered on climate change, which I think have helped to stimulate conversation about climate change in our region, which is not a place where people like to talk about climate change. These Seesaw projects, like my own scholarly work, can be described as fitting into a movement called critical regionalism. Critical regionalism emphasizes place, but in a very dynamic sense that emphasizes the relationships between any particular place and the wider world, and which seeks to solve problems not just by thinking globally and acting locally, but by finding creative fusions between regional and global ideas. Critical regionalism seeks to celebrate and protect regions in their differences of culture, language, aesthetics, landscapes, and ecosystems, from the homogenizing and exploitive forces of colonialism and globalism. At the same time, though, critical regionalists recognize that regionalism in and of itself is not a panacea to all the problems facing our world. And we recognize, too, that world culture, globalism, in a more positive sense, offers great benefits, which regional peoples should not be deprived of, including all kinds of technology, medicine, and general participation in world culture. So we see the difficulty then. Critical regionalism is a negotiation by which a place seeks the best advantage for local autonomy without selling itself out, whether that's its natural resources to mining or its local culture to tourism. In Alaska, scholars like Eric Heine, Susan Colleen, Sarah Ray, and Kevin Meyer, who's in Juneau, have all written in the vein of critical regionalism, doing this sort of cultural excavation of layers of the last frontier histories and legacies to find a sustainable sense of place in Alaska. And let me just pause here to ask, are you still seeing me okay? Because my camera has gone off. I can't see the room. We good?
We're
okay.
all here.
Cool, thank you. Just want to make sure I'm not speaking into the void. So my work with Seesaw, thinking about critical regionalism and climate change, all connects to my teaching as well. One of the main things I teach is called cli-fi, which is a sort of takeoff on science fiction, sci-fi. So cli-fi is a major movement within literature at this time. I teach authors like Kim Stanley Robinson, Margaret Atwood, Octavia Butler, and others. And students I've found are readily drawn to cli-fi, which has a strong tendency towards speculative and dystopian or apocalyptic type settings. But also I've found that my students are pretty quickly burned out and rendered kind of hopeless by the repetition of these sort of apocalyptic and dystopian narratives, to feeling like, you know, Earth has a kind of expiration date toward which we're hurtling. And it's really a rare exception in climate fiction to find a novel that has more of a realist and real world kind of engagement. Like, for example, Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior. Those books are sort of few and far between. And a lot of literary critics have recognized by now that we're badly in need of a literature of climate change that also somehow manages to be constructive or hopeful. There's also a lot of young adult cli-fi, which is also on this slide, that I have also been teaching, because I want to reach teachers who might be teaching these texts in the high schools. Okay, so in that vein of trying to be more constructive and hopeful in climate fiction, I thought, well, you know, for years I've been reading Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony, published in 1977, which is a masterpiece of American literature and Native American literature. Typically, we discuss this in the context of the American Indian Renaissance of the 1960s and 70s. But it's interesting that its publication year coincides with this novel that no one's ever heard of, but it's Arthur Herzog's Heat, which is a work of cli-fi, and it happens to be the first novel about anthropogenic climate change, again, published in 1977. So that struck me as a very interesting coincidence. Silko's work certainly owes something to the era of the environmental movement, and it's contemporaneous with climate change science, but both of these novels definitely predate sort of general public awareness of the problem of climate change. And they both significantly predate cli-fi as a literary movement. So in other words, Silko was certainly doing something quite ahead of its time when considered as climate change fiction. Silko does not readily accept labels, whether that's Native American novelist, magical realist, or eco-fiction writer. Yet reading her fiction, we can see, and she would certainly affirm, her striving as a fiction writer and poet to embrace a sense of place and to embody an oral tradition of a Native people, and to describe an indigenous sense of the world that avoids sort of Western nature culture dualisms. Understood as a writer associated with post-colonialism and critical regionalism and environmental crisis, Silko's work shows her as a writer of place or region who also positions herself as an outsider. In fact, she has always been an outsider, even at Laguna Pueblo, growing up on the margins of the reservation as a member of a mixed race family, and herself not a Carrizan language speaker. Yet her powerful ability through her fiction has been to write from the perspective of a mixed blood hero who finds ways to resist colonial exploitation and who finds a sort of mediation between indigenous and settler cultures. As with critical regionalism, the power of her fiction happens not only on the level of the content, but of the form. That is, Silko's storytelling power occurs not only on the level of plot, but as a kind of speech act. As the title Ceremony and Storyteller suggests, where language is not descriptive, but creative, having force in the world, performative. Also powerful here is her sense, anticipating Anthropocene climate change thinking, that both individually and collectively, we all bear not just economic complicity, but individual responsibility for climate change, and that we all have some responsibility to act. So, but where is the Alaska connection here? We have to go back to her early writing in the 70s. On the strength of some of her short stories set around the Laguna Pueblo, Silko earned a contract for her first novel with Viking Press. This novel, Silko's most famous work, was Ceremony, again published in 1977. Silko wrote Ceremony in Ketchikan, where she lived from 1973 to 1975. Her acknowledgments page in the novel there reads, in part, thanks to Rosewater Foundation on Ketchikan Creek, Alaska, for the artist residence they generously provided. I think this acknowledgement has puzzled readers and critics since it was published. But as I have learned, thanks to knowledge from Haley Chambers and Erica Christian and Dave Kiffer, I think it is, there's a backstory to this that we can recover. The Rosewater Foundation on Ketchikan Creek turns out to be sort of an inside joke. Desperately needing an office space where she could focus on her writing, a lawyer named Richard Whitaker provided Silko space in his office on Stedman Street. She first worked in a tiny windowless room that Whitaker used as his law library. Later, she gained access to a larger office in his building that had a window overlooking Ketchikan Creek and the Chief Johnson totem pole. Whitaker, an avid reader, was a huge fan of Kurt Vonnegut, whence came the Rosewater name. However, Rosewater might also allude to the fragrance of decaying spawn salmon in the creek during summer months, or to the fact that the legal office was located in what was historically Ketchikan's red light district, a fact that, if she knew it, in fact, Silko would have found pretty amusing, I think. And finally, to return to the acknowledgements, at this period, Silko did win a small fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts that took her from Ketchikan to Bethel, which I'll talk more about in a minute. So here you might recognize this. So Silko drafts her novel Ceremony, as well as some short stories between spring of 1973 and summer of 1975, working primarily in Whitaker's office. She remembers, quote, the first October I was in Alaska, we had 42.5 inches of rain in 31 days. She recounts in interviews that she was depressed, both homesick and affected by the lack of light and space. As a result, she says, of her description of New Mexico in the novel, every square inch of sand, dryness, sun I wrote in this room with no window, with the rain beating. I wrote because when I write, I'm there, and I did not want to be in Alaska in all that water. And so I wrote more passionately and in more detail. I made that whole world that I was so homesick for. And I never would have had, to make it in that kind of detail had I been back in New Mexico. So obviously I'm not trying to, disparage Ketchikan by any means, but I hope it comes across, I hope that this comes across as more than trivia. Like, oh, isn't this interesting? She wrote Ceremony in Ketchikan. It's much more than that. Ketchikan, in effect, created the seasonal affective disorder and sort of desperation in her that inspired one of the greatest novels of the American Southwest. I think that's spectacular. Ketchikan shaped the novel almost as a kind of negative space. She wrote what was absent. Moreover, the central problem in the novel is one of climate change. In Ceremony, the protagonist, Tayo, he goes off to World War II and is a victim in the Bataan Death March in the Philippine jungle. During that time, he curses the rain in this tropical jungle. He comes to believe that it's that curse that also brings drought to his home back in New Mexico, a crisis that kills his uncle and threatens his family and his people, a crisis that he ultimately has to solve by taking responsibility for that curse. So when Teo curses that incessant rain in the Philippine jungle, that rain is the rain drumming on the roof of the lawyer's building in Ketchikan. Tayo's curse is Silko's in her depression and homesickness. The sense of individual or cultural culpability or for responsibility to natural systems, and the sense of connection that the rain in the Philippines is connected to the rain in New Mexico, which is connected to the actual rain of Ketchikan. That, I think, is the most important lesson to take from Silko's Ceremony and from my talk today, I suppose. That is the most important lesson. And it's part of why I'm wanting to talk about southeastern Alaska, even as I'm sitting here in the Texas Panhandle. But again, why was Silko here? Well, Silko came to Ketchikan because of her husband, who was an attorney named John Silko, who was born and raised in Ketchikan and had come back to run the local office of the Alaska Legal Services. For Silko, this period was difficult. She was caring for an infant and a toddler. She was homesick. It was by far her longest time away from New Mexico. She was struggling with that lack of light and horizon, trying to write a first novel that was under contract, and in a marriage that, as she put it, quote, wasn't going so well, unquote. Nevertheless, it must have been an exciting time for her, and clearly the young author absorbed, like a sponge soaking up the rain, a great deal through her experience that's trickled into her writing career. It's noteworthy that Alaska Legal Services was founded in 1967 to serve Alaska's poor with free legal help. In 1974, ALS had over 500 cases in Ketchikan during the time of Silko's residency there. 2/3 of ALS's cases concerned Native people, including matters of land ownership, issues connected with the Alaska Claims Settlement Act, boarding schools or educational issues, issues related to housing, subsistence, fishing, all things like that. Leslie Silko, herself formerly a law student, must have found herself in the midst of conversations she found really interesting and inspiring, especially when compared to concerns of Native communities back at her place of Laguna and Acoma and Taos Pueblo during the same period. Oh yeah, here's Alaska Legal Services of Nome and Fairbanks. I could not find a picture of a Ketchikan office. Thanks to Haley Chambers for providing me this clipping from the museum there in Ketchikan, which was a wonderful find for me. While in Ketchikan, Silko received an NEA grant for $5,000 that took her much further north in February of 1974. As she describes it, quote, 80 miles from the Bering Sea and with temperatures of 50 below zero, I still found Bethel preferable to Ketchikan because at least the frozen tundra had blue sky and miles of visibility in all directions. Okay. And as she would later write to her friend, the poet James Wright, quote, I went for a month to Bethel, Alaska, an Eskimo town of 2,500. Each day I spent there, I wanted less to ever leave. And on the 29th day, I feared I had changed so that I could never leave the Bethel people without a terrible feeling of loss and sadness, as if I was born there. It took great effort to leave Bethel, and I still feel I must return there again. Although to my knowledge, she never did. It was there, Silko remembers, she had the idea so powerfully enacted in the novel Ceremony that inverts and subverts colonial history. She says, quote, I remember the day I had lunch with my friend Rose Prince in Bethel and told her and her friends about my idea to have all things European in the world created by a tribal witch. In the novel, there's this witchery contest scene, which takes place in the Pueblo country, and it convenes a meeting of tribal witches from all over the world, including Asians and Africans, and she says some Eskimos. She further notes, after I returned to Ketchikan from Bethel, I stopped work on my novel long enough to write the short story Storyteller. Although I was only in Bethel for a month, the stories I heard while I was there, stories about tundra and Yupik people, left a powerful impression on me. And the stories I heard there refused to let me get back to work on Ceremony until I wrote a short story about the place and people of the Bethel area. So out of the Bethel NEA experience, once back in Ketchikan, she wrote the short story Storyteller. This story was subsequently published in a literary journal in 1975. The story was ultimately republished in Silko's 1981 book of the same title, a collection of fiction, poetry, essay, and photograph that is, like Ceremony, considered a classic of U.S. indigenous literature and almost entirely set in the Southwest, except for one story and one poem about Alaska. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this next discussion, but I make the point that Alaska comes up in almost every book that Silko writes after that. In other words, basically every book in her career has an important Alaska angle to it. Sometimes it's subtle and sometimes it's much more pronounced, but Alaska's always there, even though most of her novels are set, right in the Southwest. So it seems as if Alaska, and particularly Bethel, for the fairly young and not very worldly Leslie Marmon Silko, made a big impression. She saw something of the world in that trip, what makes places different, but also what made them similar, especially with regard to US settler colonialism and indigenous experience. Alaska became fundamental to Silko's global imagination. With respect to critical regionalism, we see here how Silko's geographical extension, her ability to make connections between the Southwest and the far North, mattered. In comparison, she obviously finds commonalities of colonial history, but she also finds positive values, particularly in the power of storytelling and the connection to landscape. Overall, Storyteller, I think I'm behind here. Storyteller sets a bleak picture. The young Yupik woman's existence in the village from Bethel, upriver from Bethel, is fairly dire. The story is told in flashback from her position in the jail in Bethel, where she observes at winter solstice that the sun is frozen in the sky, portending end times. She yells for her jailer, a Yupik man who pretends at least only to speak English, in order to tell her story. We learn that as a child, she lost her parents to violent death and is taken in by her grandmother and this figure just called the old man, who after her grandmother's death abuses her sexually. She escapes to even worse treatment in a boarding school before returning home. In the village, her curiosity brings her into sexual liaisons with the Gusuk oilmen who have come into the country looking for black gold. In his dying months, the old man repeats endlessly a story about a man hunting a polar bear on the ice. Meanwhile, the young woman plots and executes her murder of the white shopkeeper responsible for her parents' death. Her appointed lawyer urges her to plead guilty to explain that she did not intentionally lure the man onto thin ice, but in refusing, she knows she will then have opportunity to record the old man's hunting story and her own account of her parents' murder into the record, from oral tradition into written record via the legal system, via her jailer, the young assimilated Yupik man, who will be forced to act as translator. Thus, she will succeed at transmitting vital cultural material to her threatened kin and village, keeping oral tradition, key stories, and language knowledge alive, though at the cost of her own freedom. The influence of light, climate, space, and weather, the difference between the Southwest and Ketchikan and Bethel, are very important here, reflecting Silko's comment that she felt more at home in the open expanse of tundra around Bethel than the dark rainforests of Ketchikan. The attention to season, climate, and local landscape are also relevant to Cli-Fi, as is the figure of the polar bear in the old man's story. It becomes clear that the old man's narrative, in which a hunter stalks a polar bear, who in turn has been stalking the hunter and ultimately kills him, parallels the young woman's experience. After the shopkeeper attempts to sexually assault her, she lures him onto the river ice using her knowledge of the frozen landscape to trick him onto thin ice, while she is being hunted by the sexually predatory white man associated with the oil exploration and the development of the village. She ultimately becomes the hunter and killer, as well as the prey. As she tells her story, she is both reinforcing and contributing to her tribal oral tradition and simultaneously putting her story, again, on the written legal record of the colonial system. The story has a sort of color-coded symbolism that has garnered much critical attention. Yellow signifies primarily outside technologies, like insulation and machines brought by the oilmen. The whiteness of the snow and ice enables the successful killing of the shopkeeper. White for Silko symbolizes a dangerous but potentially powerful loss of boundaries. The red tint of recycled fuel drums flattened and nailed to the house enables the young woman to locate and return safely home in the whiteout. The color red signifies in complex manner through the story. It's the story of sweet wine, of salmon split open on the drying rack, of wounded caribou, of sex and sexuality, and also for the most central and ambiguous figure, quote, something red in the grass, or quote, something red lying on the ground that the girl sees that's associated with her parents' death. Against the snow white canvas, the red of this story is linked by different kinds of violence. But the red on the ground is the blood trace of the murder that motivates the revenge that impels Storyteller. But red has other connotations too, that the people use the tin of the fuel barrels to further insulate their homes reminds us of critical regionalism and architecture and incorporating modern elements or materials into traditional structural forms. And in terms of balancing, it's important that something red associated with the poisoning of her parents, probably the sterno cans, is aligned with the red tin that saves her in the whiteout. So nothing is all bad or all good here. Red is thus implicated in the industry that brings the white oil man, particularly the one described as the red-haired man, whom I imagine as a Texas wildcatter coming to Bethel in the story, and the larger oil boom, which of course was ongoing while Silko lived in Ketchikan. So while red is integral to the story, ultimately the white and blue associated with ice and the polar bear, as well as with the sky at winter solstice, are even more significant, I think. The polar bear signifies ice and winter itself and retributive killing. And I argue climate change, for we're in a winter solstice that the young protagonist recognizes as a sort of final apocalyptic winter when the sun is frozen in the sky. The old man's story begins with the giant bear having the color of pale blue glacier ice, which he described muscle by muscle from the curve of ivory claws to the whorls of hair at the top of the massive skull. This, I think, is not the glacier bear that's a color variant of the black bear, but rather a sort of supernaturally huge polar bear. Silko's ice bear predates the rise of the polar bear as a poster animal for climate change, and the polar bear as a killer is consistent with Silko's tendency to see human and ecological and colonial misbehavior leading to the revenge of the earth or natural systems on the human. In this case, the revenge killing of the hunter, the revenge killing of the white storekeeper by the young Yupik woman is narratively aligned with the polar bear's killing of the hunter. Rather than the victim of climate change, the killer polar bear becomes the symbolic agent of revenge of nature against the development responsible for climate change. The fact that the Bethel area is outside the typical range of polar bears is perhaps noteworthy. Of course, the old man may be thinking of a bear hunt far from his own village. It's possible that the old man is Inupiaq rather than Yupik, though he seems to be revered by the villagers in a manner that suggests otherwise. I also find myself thinking about the wayward polar bear who showed up in Fort Yukon in 2014, often read as evidence of lost habitat, lost Arctic ice. In any case, we can read Silko's bear as a symbol of the natural world, suitable for our imagination of the Arctic, even though the setting is technically subarctic and not coastal. She might have used a grizzly bear, but she needed that white, that color of snow and ice, the whiteout, as part of the dramatic action of the story. If red is both danger and salvation, death and life, then the white blue of ice and the ice bear is a revenge that consumes us all together in the damage wrought by oil exploration and climate change. In 1975, Silko left Alaska. Back in New Mexico, Ceremony, now published in 1977, a reporter interviewed Silko for the Albuquerque newspaper. At this point, she was teaching at the University of New Mexico and happy to be back in New Mexico after, as she put it, quote, 2 miserable years in Alaska, unquote, which I think would make a great title for this paper, by the way. But so what accounts for Silko's 2 years in Alaska are ultimately the same economic forces that brought many north in the 60s and 70s, including my father when it comes to it. Changing times on the last frontier, politics, development, and oil. Oil development began with statehood, not coincidentally, in 1959 with $3 million in production. More production in the Kenai Peninsula and Cook Inlet brought production to 10 million in 1960 and 26 million in 1961. Good economic times meant growth at the university, again, bringing my father and his new PhD to Fairbanks in 1967. And that same year, Alaska Legal Services was created, part of the Johnson administration's Office of Economic Opportunity and the Great Society legislation going on at that time, which is what brought John Silko back to Ketchikan a few years later. Oil was discovered in Prudhoe Bay in 1968, and the real boom was on. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act passed in 1971. The legal, economic, and actual landscape were changing dramatically. During Silko's time in Alaska, the pipeline was under construction, with oil flowing by 1977. That year, though, 10,000 jobs were lost in the oil economy. My father took early retirement in 1979 with a, like a incentivized buyout. And by then the writing was on the wall. In 1986, OPEC increased production. In Alaska, the boom was bust. As for her departure from Alaska, as Silko tells it in a 2023 New Yorker interview, she told her husband that she was leaving Alaska for Albuquerque, with or without him at that time. But even though she was done with Ketchikan, she was not done with Bethel or Alaska. After Silko returned to New Mexico in '75, she actually continued work on Storyteller. In fact, during the period that saw her divorce and her winning of a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant in 1981, she worked on a film version of Storyteller, a project that went on for years, although it never came to fruition. At this time, too, she wrote a screenplay with her friend Larry McMurtry, the author of Lonesome Dove. So there's a very interesting relationship between those two writers and screenwriting. Silko's papers at the Beinecke Library at Yale University contain a number of related documents, notes, and drafts that shed light on the original story, her larger project, and its relationship to climate change. A lengthy 1980 film treatment of the story sheds much light on its essential points. A synopsis published in a 1982 Sundance Film Institute program shows Silko's goals. The Sundance Institute, incidentally, was the forerunner to the Sundance Film Festival, which Robert Redford named for his role in Butch Cassidy in The Sundance Kid. Both of Silko's film narrative versions are much more linear than the published story, and they add a few more details that eliminate some of the ambiguity of her published short story, some of which are sort of important to the story. But the film version is really interesting. In these versions, the story starts, quote, at a 1974 St. Patrick's Day cocktail party in Anchorage for Alaska Legal Services lawyers. The character named simply Attorney, who I always imagine cast as Robert Redford, leaves the party to catch a flight to Bethel to see a client from a small village. As he makes his journey, the scene shifts to 1961 in Sheldon Point, a village now officially known by its Yupik name, Nunam-Ikwa, forgive the pronunciation. Though Silko mistakenly describes Sheldon Point as 90 miles from the Bering Sea, it's described correctly as being on the Yukon and clarifies some ambiguities of the timeline and location in the short story, which only mentions Bethel as the location of the jail. The backstory during the girlhood of the protagonist is fleshed out, showing conflict between Yupik people, outside trophy hunters, Russian whalers, and oil production. We also learn that the girl is 7 or 8 when her parents die, which is here attributed to wood alcohol poisoning, which is presented as a murderous gift by the shopkeeper. In 1968, the girl, now 14 or 15, goes to the government boarding school. In 1972, when she's 16, the protagonist takes her revenge. By this time, she had taken a lover named the Geologist, and oil production in the region is described as booming, with many wells in production. Silko writes in the Sundance film version, quote, "When the ice on the river is dangerously thin, she lures the white man into a chase on the river ice. He falls through the ice and is killed. That night, the old man completes the story of the hunter and the blue glacier bear and dies like the hunter in his story died. The story of the blue glacier bear is a prophecy of the end of the human race by freezing. The freezing is brought on by corruption and irreverence of human beings. It is addressed to those Eskimos who forgot to care for and love the earth, the ocean, the animals and plants, as much as it addressed to all other human beings," unquote. So that's really interesting to me. Silko emphasizes the interwoven nature of the environment and culture. Environmental damage cannot be separated from cultural damage. While the story speaks to us all and criticizes us all, I think it's particularly, she says, addressed to the Yupik people who have forgotten traditional values. This is sort of a similar thing could be said of the stories told in Silko's ceremony and their relationship to the Pueblo people. In various files of working notes and draft fragments, Silko makes comments that shed further light on the relationship between the story and climate change. In fact, they comprise a fascinating hodgepodge of notes about the film treatment and what appears to be notes taken at a conference on native land issues, featuring one Navajo legal scholar named Claudine Arthur. These notes, partly written on the back of a typed draft of the screenplay, begin to form into a poem that Silko seems to compose. So it's quite a fascinating look at her creative process through these papers in the archives. For example, in one note, Silko explains that the protagonist finds the geologist's sexual behavior bizarre and amusing, symptomatic of his profession and the civilization it serves. Quote, "His total separation from his own passion and sexuality and his loss of any contact with anything but scientific charts and types of drill bits might be sad or possibly tragic. The protagonist uses the geologist to learn, quote, the logical extension or outcome of contemporary technological culture." Another fragmentary note in the form of a poem reads, "You have betrayed the earth. You have taken too much from her. At the end of the destruction, the ice will come. The ice will freeze everything, crack and split steel, silence the engines, stop the machines." So the world ends in ice in Storyteller, which is the corollary to Ceremony, in which the apocalypse comes by heat, drought, and nuclear fire. In both works, Silko shows that human behavior, including human abuse of the earth, leads to apocalyptic climate change. As we've seen, Silko's northern connection was enduring. In her most extended meditation on the importance of place, a 1995 essay called Interior and Exterior Landscapes, she begins by discussing the relationship between place and oral tradition in Laguna Pueblo, but ends up quickly, once again, in Bethel. Pueblo's sense of place, she explains, emphasizes a sort of non-realist aesthetic. This aesthetic joins nature and imagination to form a landscape, the sort of cultural performance of human and natural reciprocity. Again, she uses the storyteller as like what she calls her best exploration of place and that concept of place. Silko's sense of place, people, and planet resonates in useful ways with critical regionalist ideas of place as simultaneously real and imagined, local and global. Having a greater sense of place enables a critique of colonialism and of ecological destruction that's characteristic of Silko's work and of critical regionalism more generally. In Ceremony, the protagonist, to succeed and survive, must finally understand and narrate for his people the connection between the uranium mine at Laguna Pueblo and what happened at Hiroshima. The threat of oil exploration in Storyteller similarly functions as a great existential threat and a warning that must be understood. The young woman must continue the old man's polar bear story, continuing it in her own story of anti-colonialism, place knowledge, murder, and revenge. Otherwise, as Silko puts it in her 1995 essay, quote, when humans have blasted and burned the last bit of life from the earth, an immeasurable freezing will descend with the darkness that obliterates the sun. I'm imagining kind of a new ice age, actually. So finally, Silko explicates her own work in terms of her explanation of Laguna Pueblo oral tradition and landscape and identity. She places the blame on the oil industry as the latest colonial exploitation of land and people, emphasizing the ecological moral of the story, the strength of the young woman residing in her deeply knowledgeable relationship with the place, land, and weather. And there's a power, too, in her hybridity, her marginal position in the village, her curiosity that led her to choose a year of boarding school education, to seek sexual liaisons with the white oilfield workers, to question the meaning of the old stories, and to forge her new story. The young woman is not a martyr, but a hero, ultimately. She often laughs out loud as she enacts her design. It is a design that's enabled by her understanding of old and new, insider and outsider. If Silko's work is considered Southwestern in terms of traditional regionalism, it should be regarded as much more in terms of critical regionalism. Enjoying the short story form and the dynamics of oral tradition, enjoying Laguna Pueblo and Yupik cultural values and colonial histories, we see a new form that enacts without exposing traditional stories and a powerful critique of settler colonial exploitation. Always surpassing labels and categories, Silko's work anticipates and supersedes, in a way, cli-fi from an indigenous perspective, anticipating the idea of Anthropocene fiction as a timid and even misguided or limited concept. Here we have a literature of planetary consciousness and human-Earth reciprocity. Here, Alaska and the Southwest are connected in the same webs of colonial history, climate, and indigenous storytelling. In thinking of my work as a professor of American literature, my role as the director of the Center for the Study of the American West, and my abiding interests in U.S. colonial legacies as they relate to region and climate change and storytelling, I made a whole bunch of layered arguments here that I hope came through, but namely that regional, interdisciplinary, and public-facing scholarship is more than ever vital, that critical regionalism gives us a lens through which to do this kind of work, and that the Alaskan connections in the work of Leslie Silko give us a powerful model for contemporary critical regionalist work as we rethink our place and borders and our future on a warming planet. Where I live was once the Dust Bowl and seems bent on returning to the dust. Alaska, as you well know, faces challenges of threatened salmon runs, thawing permafrost, and sea level rise. My place here saw violent removals of indigenous people from what was previously the Comancheria. Alaska, by this contrast, seems to be much more productively engaged with Native people and issues, including the matter of how climate change is affecting indigenous villages. We need to connect, I think, because when we do so, we build something useful beyond pure research or pure critique. When we connect, we build for the future, even in places with expiration dates. Whether in Alaska, Texas, or anywhere else on the planet, I think we have much to discuss. So thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for listening. Really appreciate being here and would love to have some conversation around that. Thank you.
So Marnie, I know you have some questions in the chat and we have someone who can unmute themselves, I think.
Yes. So first question is, what were you most surprised by from your research into Silko's time here in Ketchikan? If you can hear me.
Yeah. What I was most surprised by, to be honest, was the persistence of that storyteller, that I did not know that she had written it in Ketchikan initially. And I really didn't know the whole history of the film treatment, that she was really trying to make this into a movie in 1980. And she kept at that for at least through 1985 or 6. She was still sort of trying to get that film, somebody to buy that film, you know. And I just didn't realize that that story was so important to her that she had turned it into a screenplay, and kept trying to market it that way, you know. Also, when I went back and was sort of rereading Silko's work, I was struck by, and I said this earlier, but you know, like in Almanac of the Dead, which is her big 1991 novel, a really important part of that story takes place in Bethel. In her 1999 novel, Gardens in the Dunes, that's set in the late 19th century, and part of it takes place in a boarding school in California. And the protagonist runs into some Alaska Native women, young women at that boarding school. And as I said, in ceremony, in the witch ceremony scene, there are Eskimo witches at that event that takes place in the Southwest. And I think the whole novel ceremony is shaped by Alaska, in a kind of, you know, again, as a sort of negative space. So what surprised me was how convinced I was by my own kind of tentative hypothesis that Alaska really matters to understanding the work of Leslie Marmon Silko. And she's a major author, and there are many books and articles written about her work. And yet never is she approached it from this direction, right? So it's a really interesting angle, and I think a really productive angle to thinking about the relevance of her work to thinking about climate change in particular. So that's what I found most surprising. And also I have to get to Yale so I can get a better look at the papers there.
All right, do we have a question from someone online?
They're thinking.
Okay. Yeah, well, I think we can definitely say you've got an open invitation to come and visit us here in Ketchikan.
Well, I was about to say, give me a reason. If you can give me a reason, I could maybe find a way to get there. I would love to come up there. Yeah, I would jump at that. So, I know there are people, I guess, as I understood it, there are folks living in Ketchikan who are maybe still Silko family there, as well as Leslie's sister.
You're getting a lot of nods from the audience here. Yeah, I think it's her sister still lives here. Judy Pilchers. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. You know, I don't know why she ended up in Ketchikan. That's really interesting. I would love to know more about that story. So, I mean, this is a project that is very much ongoing, not finished. So I would love to add to it. I would love to make Ketchikan more central in it. I've never been to Bethel either, for that matter, but I would love another opportunity or another excuse to buy a ticket and get up to Alaska. So
awesome. Any other questions? All right. Well, Alex, thank you so much, and thank you so much for everyone who joined us virtually online. And we'll have this, you know, posted, and you can reflect back on it on our YouTube channel here in the coming weeks. So we definitely want to keep up to date on where this takes you.
I love it. Thank you very much. Keep in touch. By the way, I have my email on this last slide, and again, if anyone would like to chat with me about any aspect of this, or if I could get a hold of local folks there who know more of the background, who were here in the 70s, I would love to talk to them. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, folks.